Hey everyone, before we start the show, I just want to get some plugs out of the way. If you enjoy this podcast and you're into wrestling, check out the Nerds and Marks podcast or Marty and Sarah Love Wrestling. If you're not getting your fill on movie and entertainment discussion, then check out the Entertainment Buffet podcast. If you want to dive into the world of video games, I highly recommend the Darkcast by my friends over at darkstation.com. Listen to them cover important topics and interview men and women from all over the industry. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show. Hello everyone and welcome to today's episode of Shelved. I am your host, Jeremy Meyer. So we're actually hosting another interview today, and this one is actually an interview with a friend of mine named Jeff Stolhand. He's a director, writer, producer based out of Austin, Texas, and I've known Jeff for a few years now. He actually went to school with my parents, and when my mom found out that I was interested in screenwriting and filmmaking, she basically set forth to introduce us, and we've been in contact over the years. Jeff has always been a big help to me. I work on my writing, and I always bounce ideas off of him, and he's actually bounced some ideas off of me, and we've just kind of become some good friends over the years. And, he wanted to come on the podcast. He's actually a listener, and he wanted to sit down and talk about a short film of his that is currently out on YouTube. You can actually go look it up now. It's called Rain. It's a short film. It's actually an X-Men fan film. And we talk about the process of how that came about, how he got involved with the project. We also talk a little bit about some screenwriting tips and tricks and stuff. I do get some people every now and then that contact me through either YouTube comments or the podcast email just asking about screenwriting advice. And it was never an intention when I started the podcast, but it's something I will gladly give my 2 cents on, because I think anyone who's interested in screenwriting deserves to give it a shot, and I want to encourage people to, take the same attempts that I'm taking and, just go for it. That's the beautiful thing about writing, is you can just go for it, and that's something we also talk about on the show. This is something I bring up to him, but there wouldn't be a podcast if it wasn't for Jeff. It was because of his advice that led to my research that led to this idea of this podcast. I mean, I always knew I wanted to do a podcast. I just never knew what I wanted it to be about. And it's because of Jeff and his advice that led me to this idea of, why don't we talk about scripts that were never made? So it's a fun interview. It's only about like 35 to 40 minutes. So I hope you enjoy it, and be sure to check out his short film, Rain, available on YouTube.
Yeah.
But, the long hours cut into my writing time. That's kind of my biggest downside.
Sure.
Like, I try to do my writing on my lunch break, and it's like I get home at like 11 o'clock midnight, and it's like, well, I don't really have the brain capacity right now, so, because I'm just wiped.
Oh, man.
But, yeah, so a lot of my writing ends up getting done on my lunch. It's like I'll try to at least get, like, my general rule of thumb is like 2 pages a day. This is what I try to get in.
Yeah.
And I feel like I've accomplished something then. But
yeah. I think the best stretch I had with writing consistently is I get up and I do it first thing. And
yeah.
I mean, I don't do that all the time, but I hit a stride where I was doing it from like, get up, get settled, get some coffee, and write for, even if it was just 2 hours, hour and a half to 2 hours. And it's weird because I get, I'll save it for the podcast. I'll save that story.
Well, I'm actually already recording, so we can kind of just jump into it.
Okay, gotcha. Oh, sure. Well, no, I'll finish that story then. So, I did this stretch where I would get up and I try to do at least 2 hours in the morning. And some days you would sit there and you would just stare. And then one day you'd crank out like 5 pages. And then one day you do a page. And then another day you'd six pages. And another day you do nothing. But what's good, I used to think that if you weren't physically putting words on the screen or the page, that you weren't getting anything done. And then one day I realized, a lot of it's just processing. You're thinking, you're processing and processing and processing. And those 2 or 3 days you think, or that you sit there and you're just ruminating over an idea, that's just as valuable, because on that 5th or 6th day, suddenly the light goes on and you crank out, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12 pages. So I've gotten now to where I don't think in terms of, my goal isn't pages per day, but it's time. I want to put this much time in. So
yeah, I've definitely flirted with different methods, and I was actually listening to a podcast with Rob Zombie of all people. He was talking about doing the Devil's Rejects and what was that other one, House of a Thousand Corpses, and he was just like, I shoot for 2 pages a day, and I was like, that's not a bad way to think about it. Let me try that. And I was working on a new script at the time, and it's one I'm going to have to rewrite almost completely now. But I would sit there and I would be like, all right, on my lunch break at work, let's see if I can get 2 pages a day. And some days I would do 2 pages, some days I would do 5 pages, and that pace kept up until I hit about like 76 pages. And then I was like, all right, well, let me kind of look back through this. And it was like, oh, there is a lot of rewriting that's going to happen here.
Yeah, but it's always going to be rewriting. You're always rewriting, it seems like. But there's a good book, The Coffee Break Screenwriter. I don't know if you've seen that or not.
I have not.
Pilar I think it's Pilar Alessandra is how you say it, but it's a good book on how you can, squeeze in those moments and get things done. Like you said, when you're on your lunch break or on your coffee break or whatever. And I think it sounds weird, but some of my best ideas are when I'm not even writing. You're on the treadmill or you're in the shower or whatever. And I tend to think that your brain the subconscious locks onto these ideas and sometimes still works on them even when you're not really thinking about it.
Yeah, I'm the classic case of losing sleep because I come up with a really good idea right when I'm falling asleep. And then it's like, well, I have to write this down. So I'll get up and take notes on my phone or something. And then sometimes that'll keep going for like an hour, or I'll just, I'll take my note and I'll try to go back to sleep. But that's definitely, I buy into that because it's the most inconvenient times when I'm trying to sleep, when I'm trying to drive, or an idea, like those times where you're alone and you can just think that these ideas pop in your head.
And the one time you don't get up and write it down and then you forget it in the morning, you're
exactly.
Like, that wasn't good.
Exactly. So like my notes on my phone are just full of just tons of notes that I may never use, but it's like at least I took it down.
Yeah.
What was the?
Well, I found that. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, what was the name of that book again?
It's called The Coffee Break Screenwriter.
The Coffee Break Screenwriter. Okay, I just wanted to make sure I got that.
Yeah. It's got a lot of good tips in it. But yeah, it's like, the great thing about keeping notes on different ideas and different projects is I've even been working on a script where I get stuck on a certain spot and then I see a note for a totally unrelated story and I go, well, that works here. So you just, adapt it for that situation and you can plug in those holes sometimes with an idea that was originally for something totally different.
Yeah, and for me, it's like I have a bunch of different types of projects, and it's like, oh, like I'm in the mood for like maybe something a little more sci-fi, so I'll take some notes on this or do some writing on that. Yeah. But then it's like maybe I'll see an awesome action movie, and it's like, oh, well, I have this action idea I'm working on. Why don't I kind of work on that now because that's what I'm feeling. So I often find myself kind of bouncing around of different things. And when I actually sit down to write, it's like, all right, let's try to pick one that I feel the most passionate about right now and work on that one as long as that passion remains. And then when my focus maybe goes towards something else, start working on that one.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I think, if you get stuck on one idea and you get too frustrated, you can always jump over to the other one and try to get something done on that.
Yeah, like for me, it's like if I get one word written down, I feel like I've accomplished something.
Yeah.
Like last night. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll just tell the story real quick. Like last night, I couldn't sleep, and I was up at like midnight, and I'm like, well, why don't I open the laptop? And I've been working on this outline that you've been helping me with over the last few weeks, and I think I got like one sentence down, but it was like that was something. Like I'm moving.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
that's a good story, by the way. I like that. I think that's a good idea.
Oh, of just like getting one word down, or
no, the story that you were working on, the outline.
Oh yeah.
Sharing. I think that's cool.
Yeah, I haven't really talked about it on the podcast, but maybe that's something I will bring up at one point, just because like it's still really early. But
sure.
That brings up a question I kind of wanted to ask you, because you're someone who actually works in the business, and you've made things, you've written things, and actually work, and you listen to the podcast. And I've just been curious about somebody who actually has more experience with this stuff than I do. How you feel about the way we kind of approach the scripts in the podcast, and just the way we talk about them, and if you had any advice or anything that I wish you would talk about this more or whatever.
Yeah, gosh, that's a good question. First of all, I'm a big fan of podcasts. I'm a podcast fanatic, and yours is one that's right there on my phone. I listen to podcasts just about every day, and I think you guys are doing a great job. I really like it a lot.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
No, it's really good. I like the angle that you go into the stories and into the analyzation of the scripts and how you break it down. Off the top of my head, I really don't have any new direction to give you, but I'll think about that. But when I'm listening to the next one, I'll process it and see if I have any ideas. But yeah, I like your take on it. That's what's kind of interesting about the podcast is, it's very branded. A lot of podcasts are kind of all over the place, but the ones I like are very specific to we're gonna do this.
Yeah.
We're gonna talk about this side of the story, and I think that's smart. I think that's really smart.
Yeah, because I'm approaching it from an amateur perspective versus I have some experience with the process, but a lot of my guests are just friends of mine who this is their first time reading scripts. So often I feel like we are just talking about the story, and I generally let my guests pick the scripts, and I have this huge spreadsheet of just like, here's the name of the script and the log line, and I let people pick what they think sounds interesting. And a lot of it kind of boils down to like superhero stuff, because there's a lot of unmade superhero stuff.
Sure.
But I've just always been interested, because basically we just end up reviewing the story, and it's hard to talk about the actual process of writing on that kind of show. And that's something I wish we could get a little more into.
Here's what's interesting to me about that approach, though, is as writers, we're always trying to figure out how, because a lot of times, I send scripts out, to my manager or whatever, and, a lot of people are going to read them. And these same people are reading a lot of scripts.
Yeah.
So what can you do to make yours really pop? What can you do it's not just about having a great story and a great log line and all those things. It's what makes it a good read, so you can get it to the next level.
Yeah.
And so, when I listen to you guys talking about a script, it's interesting to hear, well, I got excited about this part, and this is why. Because it's good to know, what gets someone who's just reading a script and maybe hasn't seen a film, what gets them excited about it.
Yeah, it's good to hear. Like, it's one thing I get nervous about with the podcast. I'm like, is it interesting from this angle? It's nice to know that somebody with some experience can agree. And like you said, so what you just said reminds me of this. I don't even remember where I saw it. It was like a Facebook meme or something a long time ago, but it was related to screenwriting, where it's like the first picture is like a huge stack of papers, and it's like, and I think the first picture is actually, it's like a small stack of papers. It's like the story you have, and then a huge stack of papers in the next picture, and it says what you write, and then it's like 2 or 3 papers in the next page, and it's like what they buy or what they read, I guess, is what you would say. And it's always been like people who I've had some people email the podcast asking about writing tips, and it's a lot of work for what little bit they're actually going to look at. And that's something I always tell people to keep in mind.
Yeah. I think that, efficiency in storytelling is really important. You're really, some of the best scripts I've read are just so lean and muscular in how they're written. They get straight to the point, and the descriptions just really pop, and they don't over-describe. And that's I often do a pass just on that. When I get a script that I'm pretty happy with, I'll go back and do a pass just on, descriptions and action and things like that, and try to make it as lean as possible, because, you want to keep them excited and moving through the script.
Yeah. And I don't know if you know this, but a good reason this podcast even exists is because of you, because you
Really?
gave me the advice a long time ago of, like, I don't know if you know this, I looked this up recently, but we've known each other for about 4 years now.
Wow.
Which was,
that doesn't even seem possible.
I know. And it was all about, my mom introducing me to you, because she found out that this was something I was interested in, and she's like, I went to school with somebody who's like doing this now, and maybe you should talk to him. And she's the one who actually introduced us. And
yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, that was 4 years ago. I looked it up on Facebook.
Wow.
But I totally forgot where I was going with this story. Oh yeah, but it was your advice that was like, well, if you want to know more about screenwriting, you should read a lot of scripts just to kind of see the process and how people do it, and it's kind of like your own little film school basically. And
right.
It was that advice that led me to reading a ton of scripts, and it was one of the first scripts I read that never got made that we did eventually cover on the show was the original script to Ridley Scott's Prometheus, which was way more of an Alien prequel than what the movie turned out to be, even though that is, I really love that movie. But it was one of those things where it's like, I read that script and I was like, oh man, this is like a very different version of the movie, and it's crazy that we never got to see this. And it was one thing I always knew I wanted to do a podcast. Years later, when I finally started it, it was like, oh, I should just do that. Like, I really found myself loving reading the scripts that never happened. Like, another classic one is Kevin Smith wrote the Superman Live script that they even made a documentary about, which was a script we also covered on the show. And actually one of my favorite ones we read on the show. But yeah, it's like that kind of thing where it's like how you said, like, the readability of a script is, I've definitely noticed some scripts read a lot better than others. And it's been a really interesting process to kind of like see how different people do it. And even talking about the way you talk about being descriptive is like, some people will handle that totally differently. Where like, you'll read a fight scene, for example, and some people will get a little specific, like, oh, they throw an elbow, catches the face or whatever. And some people will just write, they fight, so-and-so gets the upper hand. And it's like really interesting to see the difference.
Blah, blah, blah. And the result is XYZ. Yeah.
A really good example is the Matrix Reloaded script. The scene where Neo is fighting all of the Agent Smiths in the park or whatever. That scene reads, I think it's like written entirely as metaphor. And like, I remember reading that script a long time ago. I haven't gone back to it since with like a more refined perspective, but I remember reading it and it's just basically all written as metaphor. So that was like a really interesting way to look at that scene. And then, you know, they're writers and directors, so maybe they're looking at it differently. And that's going to add a whole new perspective.
Well, the important thing in a fight scene or any kind of action scene is, what happens in the story? How does it affect the story? And so, getting into too much detail, unless you're going to, if you're going to direct that to the point that you want exactly this to happen, that's one thing. But, from a larger budget, you're going to bring in stunt people and choreographers and all these guys that are going to come up with all these amazing ideas on what should happen in this fight scene. And so from a storytelling point of view, it's just important to know, like you said, who gets the upper hand, what happens here, who loses, how does this affect the story, how does our hero get out of the situation?
Exactly.
It's the story beats that are important.
And that's something I've actually been experimenting with in the script that we've been talking about, because it is a very action-heavy script. Is I've kind of been taking the stance of, like, there are some specifics, but it's more specific to how it deals with the character and the way the character is progressing through the specific event.
Right.
But you worked on a short film recently. I guess, I don't know about recently. Was it last year or the year before?
Yeah, came out, I think, when was it, April last year or something like that?
Yeah, called Rain, which
right.
It's essentially an X-Men fan film, correct?
Right.
So what I saw that you sent me the script over, and am I correct in seeing that the screenwriter was actually the main actress as well?
Yeah, basically, the way that project happened is the lady who wanted to do this story, her name is Maya Quick, and she had wanted to do this fan film and raise some money on Kickstarter for it. And once she, got the money together, she was like, "Oh wow, now I got to make a movie. What do I do?" And so,
it's a good problem to have.
And yeah, and so, through her research and talking to people, she got led to one of my writing and directing partners that I work on projects with, named Zane Rutledge. And Zane does a lot of special effects. He's got a great eye for production design and effects. He's done, he worked on Chosen, which is a really great show. He's done a lot of stuff for the Duplass brothers. And so he's a good effects guy.
Okay.
And this story obviously had a lot of effects in it.
Yes. And that's something I want to ask you about a little later.
Yeah, sure. So Zane read it, and he's like, "This is really interesting," and so he called me and said, "I got this thing that kind of came to me. I'm trying to figure out what to do with it." And he said, "I know you're not a comic book guy," which I'm not. I mean, Zane is more of a comic book guy than I am. When I grew up, my dad taught high school and taught college, and he taught literature and philosophy. And so when I was growing up, my comic books were El Cid and, the Jungle Book and the Odyssey and stuff that my dad was, telling me stories about. And so, but, storytelling is storytelling. And whether it's that mythology, is deep, whether it's a comic book story or a Greek myth or, a rom-com, it's all kind of the same in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So anyway, Zane sat down with me and he said, why don't you read this and see what you think? And what I liked about it was that it had a real strong emotional through line. That's stuff that kind of speaks to me. And I said, I think we could do something with this if we can. It was her pass, and there was a lot of great stuff in it, and there was a lot of stuff that had to be tightened and fixed and moved around a little bit.
Yeah.
And so Zane and I did a rewrite on it, and by the time he and I had rewritten it, he and I and Maya were all kind of on the same page with the new version of the script, and then we realized it was pretty ambitious for the amount of money she had, so she did a secondary campaign and got the budget up to something like $20,000, which is still not a lot of money for a project like this. And so then Zane and I brought on our friend Matt Joyce, who's a really good producer, and Zane. Just to give you some background, Zane and I ironically met through Facebook when he moved back to Texas from the Bay Area. And, he and I started we met, because we were both in the same business, and started working on personal projects together, short films and screenplays, and then started doing a lot of corporate commercial stuff together for Dell and Chevron and people like that. And so he and I had done a lot of work together.
Yeah.
And so this looked like a really fun project that we could sink our teeth into. And so we brought on Matt, who's our producer on some of the corporate stuff, and then just started putting it together. We started, trying to design how we were going to pull this off. And originally we talked about, do we want to use actual locations? Because, we were very conscious of the amount of money we had, which wasn't much.
Which brings me to a question, actually. Were there any actual locations in this movie? I mean, it seems like there was some on-location shooting, but it seemed like a lot of green screen, actually.
It was a lot of green screen, and Matt got us a deal at what was essentially a giant warehouse, which gave us just a gigantic space.
Yeah. And
said, you can have this space and do with it what you will. And so Zane and I were talking about it. He said, well, we really need to build a set. We can't do what we want to do in an actual location. We've got to create a set for this.
Yeah.
So it's funny. We just built it. Just built a bunch of walls, and we had a production designer named Joe Avaraji, who's a super talented guy. He helped us figure out a lot of the stuff. And Zane, was out at this site building flats and making the street scene. And by the time it was done, we shot most of it, on this location. And then we actually see that it's funny, the scene in the hotel.
Yeah.
Where we've got this great aerial shot, looking straight down, onto the bathroom, and she's lying in the tub, and this horrible, that was built at Zane's house.
Oh, really? Yeah, because that's what I was going to ask. It seems like as far as sets, you built an alleyway and a hotel room, and that seems to be about it.
Yeah. The alleyway doubled for a couple of different locations. The bar was a real location.
Oh, yeah, the bar as well.
The hotel, and that some of those great shots in that hotel scene, I got to give a shout out to Brandon Torres, our DP. He's just a really talented guy also. Mm-hmm. But we built that at Zane's house, and there was hardly any room outside of that set. We were squeezing in and out of different areas, trying to get in and out of that space. But
oh, really?
It's you go down and you buy fake brick wallpaper from Home Depot, and you get we bought a bathtub and a sink, and we just rigged all that stuff at Zane's place, and then Joe came in and made it look like this horrible, crappy, dumpy, hotel room, and it's amazing what you can do if you really,
wow. So that brick alleyway was wallpaper?
That was exactly. Yeah.
That was really convincing wallpaper, because I assumed it was kind of like the fake brick paneling that you would put on like a side of a house, like the way some people do.
Yeah, no, it was just it was just flats that were built to a certain height, and then above that height, Zane did set extensions digitally, so all the buildings and stuff behind those flats were digital. And then we rigged. You can see it in one of the shots. There's a cool little manhole cover where there's like smoke coming out.
Yeah, I noticed that.
That was all rigged, and Joe built that floor because it was just cement, and we had people falling and jumping around on it. So he had to go through and build sort of a fake floor on top of the pads so that it would still look like concrete as much as possible. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. A couple things. I've recently become fascinated with the idea of set building, so it's interesting to hear that story. A buddy of mine sent me a video of them building a fast video of them building all the sets on Alien Covenant recently, which was super cool and interesting. So I think I actually shared that on my Facebook. But there's I am a big fan of fan films. There was a period in my life where and I think that's one of the things that kind of got me interested in filmmaking, was the fact that seeing other people like, oh, you can just go do this. Sure. I fell down a hole of watching a bunch of Star Wars fan films right after high school, and that idea has always been fascinating to me. But as far as this one goes, this is maybe some of the most extensive CGI work I've ever seen in a fan film before, and it was awesome.
Well, and that's 98% Zane, and it's funny because it's crazy. You watch the end of these movies now, and the digital team is like pages and pages, just scrolls forever. Yeah. There's it looks like 6 million guys working, and on ours we had Zane and a couple of other people, and that was it. So,
which is very impressive. I mean, I don't know a lot about how CGI, that whole process works, aside from just what I've seen in making of features and movies and stuff. So it's crazy to see such a small team doing really good work. I thought all of it looked really good for, as you said, a $20,000 fan film. Yeah.
Well, and I'll tell you what's interesting. And filmmakers who are listening to the podcast may already be doing this. This was kind of our process. What we did was we cloned the hard drives. We had a backup drive, and then we had I had a drive and Zane had a drive, and we linked up everything via Dropbox.
Yeah.
So I was doing the edit and the sound mix and the sound effects, and Zane was doing the visual effects. And so, I'm kind of an early morning guy, and Zane, to my recollection, was more of a late night guy. Mm-hmm. So with everything synced via Dropbox, if I did an edit in the morning, by the time he logged in that afternoon, he'd have the latest edit.
Yeah.
And if he did an After Effects shot and dropped it in, when I came in the next day to work, it's like, oh, there's effects here. That's really cool. So, we just did it all, via Dropbox and syncing it all so we could just keep working on separate parts of the movie to keep it moving. It was really helpful.
Yeah, Dropbox has become a very valuable tool. I used to use it when I worked for a video game website, and we did a podcast, and we would all record our own separate audio and share it with Dropbox and everything, so the guy editing could have access to it.
Sure.
Man, I keep losing my thought here. I had something like. So you said you weren't like a big comic book guy, but as far as like comic book movies go, do you watch any of those or?
Oh, sure. Yeah. No, I mean, I definitely love the movies. I just growing up, I was always a movie fan, and I was always shooting little projects with my friends, and I just wasn't, a big comic book reader as a kid. But the movies, I love them. Yeah, they're great.
Yeah, I was always a comic book fan as a kid, but didn't have access to a lot of comics. Like there was no comic book shop where we grew up, really. But it was like in my later years, I've kind of become a huge collector and stuff like that, and the movies and stuff. I know we had a conversation like a month ago, and I asked you about Logan if you had seen that. I don't know if you still have seen it.
I still have not seen that. I have not. I need to.
Yeah, after watching this fan film, which I don't want to give too much away because I definitely think people should go see it. Which you can just look it up on YouTube. It's called Rain, a short film. But it very much reminds me of Logan, but from Storm's perspective.
Interesting.
Because it seems like this is a even farther future than the X-Men kind of portrays, and they mention like, oh, a lot of them are dead and stuff like that. Like there's hints to the other X-Men characters, even though we're only focusing on Storm. And Logan is very much that kind of movie. It's like, here's Wolverine kind of at the end of his run, and, there's mentions to the other X-Men, but it is simply a Wolverine story, like, in the future when he's a lot older. So I would definitely recommend checking that out, because that was kind of the vibe I was getting from it.
Well, when we were shooting Rain, hang on, I just lost my train of thought.
That's fine.
You were saying about Logan, right. I was just going to say, when we were shooting Rain, Hugh Jackman came by the set to get some tips on Logan. And,
oh, really?
And no, I'm just kidding.
That would have been impressive.
I'll have to watch that. I saw an interesting thing online the other day talking about the Logan story and comparing it to some other films with the same kind of emotional thread. And those movies are great. When you can really, when a good action picture can go beyond the action and really capture you emotionally. That's what I like. I think that's really fun.
Yeah, and Logan is very much a emotional, character-driven story. Like it has action. It is a comic book movie.
Yeah.
But it is unlike any of the other comic book movies that have come out before it.
Really? Now I definitely got to watch it.
Yeah, he got nominated for Best Picture at this year's Oscars for The Greatest Showman. And I haven't seen The Greatest Showman, but I kind of like to hope it was a nod for both movies, because he 100% deserved to be nominated for Logan.
Wow.
Like, it is a movie that will probably make you cry at the end, especially for comic book fans, where he's been playing the character for 16 years, I think it was, and this was his last time doing it. Because I think the first X-Men came out in 2000 or 2001, like early 2000s. And he's been that character since the beginning, and this was going to be his last movie. So it's a really nice cap on everything, and it's a very good emotional story. So I definitely think that'll be right up your alley.
Yeah, I'll check it out.
But yeah, I definitely recommend people checking out Rain, which I watched again today. It's I was going to ask you about Maya. So you said, did she have any experience in the industry at all, or is this just something she decided to do?
Well, she had some, she had been in a band, so she had some entertainment background, in terms of being, out there in front of people. And, she had studied some martial arts and that kind of thing. But in terms of making a film, no, this was, to my knowledge, this was her first outing.
Wow, so she just decided, so great, I'm going to write a storm movie.
Which is the way you got to do it. Sometimes, you just got to go out there and say, I'm just going to do this thing.
Yeah.
And so, big props for doing that, because that's, sometimes you're just not going to get it done any other way. You just got to say, yep, I'm just going to do it.
Yeah, which is something I would stress to anybody interested in movies is writing is something that you can just do. If you're watching movies and you're asking yourself, this is something I've heard from Kevin Smith many times, is the reason why he made Clerks, is he's like, nobody seems to be making a movie for me and my friends. And he's like, well, why don't I just make that movie?
Yeah.
And it's something like, I don't know if a lot of people realize is like, you have the ideas, you can make them, like you can write them down and see where it takes you.
And also the great thing about doing, if you're just starting out doing shorts and things like that, is you can learn the difference between writing the script and then translating that script to images, because it's a different process. And so you start to realize, for example, how sometimes a scene, you don't need everything that's there. You can write a scene, and on the page it seems like that makes perfect sense. And then, I'll tell you a funny story. I listened to, I'm forgetting his name. He's a Texas screenwriter. I want to say this was on Tom. He wrote Tom Horn, which was a Steve McQueen movie years ago. And I don't remember the story exactly. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but he wrote this monologue, this great emotional, opus that either the director wanted or he as a writer wanted. I don't remember the circumstance. Yeah. Big long thing. And he gives it to Steve McQueen, and Steve looks at it and says, I can do that with a look. and I thought, and the point being, once you get the actor on camera, a lot of what you've written is in their eyes and is in their mannerism and is in, how they interact in the scene. And that's what you can learn, as a new filmmaker, by writing your stuff and then shooting it. You go, that scene might have worked better with less dialogue, or it might have worked better with more. You know, and those are the kinds of things that are fun to play with, in terms of, like I said, translating the pages to actual moving images. That's when you really start to learn, what on the page makes more sense or less sense.
Yeah, a movie is an ever evolving process. I was listening to a podcast with Eli Roth recently, and he just put out that Death Wish remake with Bruce Willis.
Right.
He was talking about, they have a scene in the movie where, I've never seen the original Death Wish, but basically it's Charles Bronson, I believe. And, his family gets killed and he kind of becomes a vigilante. And this movie, it's the same thing. And he has a scene where he goes to see a therapist, and it's like, him trying to deal with this, very sad and blah, blah, blah. And then he said that while they were in the room shooting the scene, it's like, look, we got like 10 more minutes or like 30 more minutes with this set or whatever. He's like, why don't we shoot an extra scene? And they shot a scene where it's like supposed to be later in the movie where, after he's kind of started his vigilante antics, where he goes in and he's all happy and in a better mood. And she's like, man, you've really turned things around. Like, whatever you're doing, keep doing it, even though that means he's like murdering people. But, she doesn't know that. And, they just came up with this, funny little tag on that moment just in the room. Yeah.
And that's smart. That's smart. Hey, you've got the space, you've got the time. Why not play with it and do something different? A lot of times, when I'm shooting something, if I get what I want and I get what the actor wants, and we feel happy about it, then if we have time, we'll say, okay, let's do something we've never thought about. Let's shoot this in a totally different way. And sometimes you come up with something even better, and sometimes it's a bust. But it's fun if you have time to do that and play around with it.
Yeah, I've often heard some directors say they have a theory of you shoot what's on the page, you shoot one with the actor's input, and then if you have time, you just play with it, basically like you're saying.
Sure.
So at least
exactly.
you have it as it was written, and you can play with it and see if maybe you can get something better. And then obviously that'll get picked out during the editing, I assume.
Right.
I don't know. I think that's kind of all I have to ask about the short film. I highly recommend people check it out. If there's anything else you have to say about it.
Not really. I just appreciate the time, and I'm a big fan of the podcast. And everybody who worked on our project was, we had a lot of super talented folks. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and again, it's called Rain. It's available on YouTube. People can just go check that out.
If you just Google, go to YouTube and put in Rain fan film, you'll find it.
Yeah. And I just want to thank you for coming on. As I said, I've known you for 4 years now. You've been helping me greatly for 4 years, and I just wanted to let you know that this podcast probably wouldn't exist without that help, because it's kind of what steered me into this direction.
Well, no, that's awfully kind of you.
And yeah, I know I've got some stuff I'll be sending you behind the scenes later with some of my own writing stuff, and maybe I'll share some of that on the podcast. I'd love to have you on again at some point if we got something else to talk about.
That sounds great. Well, you have a great rest of your weekend.
All right, you too, man. I really appreciate you coming on.
Okay, man. Talk to you soon.
All right, thanks.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.